Starting at 11:52 a.m., the subject arrived on campus, shortly away from campus. We have tracked his movements onto the campus, through the stairwells, up to the roof, across the roof to a shooting location. After the shooting, we were able to track his movements as he moved to the other side of the building, jumped off of the building, and fled off of the campus and into a neighborhood. We do have good video footage of this individual.
Imagine a figure moving at the back of the hall where Charlie was sitting, quiet, purposeful, a bag slung close, the kind of motion your eyes catch a second too late. Who is that? Why the hurry? Why the hush? In a country governed by laws, duties, and public promises, why do the moments that matter most arrive wrapped in silence? And why does the official story so often sound finished before the first real questions even begin? September 10th, 2025. Utah Valley University. A debate that should have been routine. Charlie Kirk steps to the mic. The room vibrates with anticipation and disagreement, like any campus night built for argument. Then, shots. Panic. A stampede of instincts. Duck, run, shield. In under a minute, the auditorium becomes the kind of place it was never meant to be. And almost as fast, the what happened turns into here is what you should believe happened. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. Authorities name a suspect within hours. 22-year-old Tyler James Robinson. The official story clicks together with remarkable ease. A rooftop behind the venue. A rifle recovered nearby, wrapped in a towel. DNA on that towel said to match Robinson. A partially destroyed note described as evidence of intent. One actor, one vantage point, one motive. Case, if not closed, then certainly boxed and labeled. But when a narrative assembles itself this neatly, shouldn't we slow down? Who benefits from a story that leaves so little room for doubt? The public finds comfort. Prosecutors gain momentum. Institutions avoid hard questions about preparation and security. Yet where, inside that speed, does the evidence get to breathe? Where does patience make its case? Take the DNA. DNA on the towel sounds definitive, until you ask the next questions. Does DNA prove a trigger pull, or only contact at some time in some way? When did the chain of custody begin? Who handled the towel first, and with what precautions? Was it ever stored with other items that could transfer trace material? How many loci were profiled? Was the sample mixed or clean? These are not technicalities for their own sake. They are the rails that keep certainty from derailing into assumption. If we skip them, are we following science or a headline? Consider the note. Investigators say it signals intent. But intent is heavier than words on a damaged page. Who authored it? Verified how? If handwritten, what do pressure patterns and letter formations say? If printed, what about printer artifacts or a digital trail? When exactly was it created? In what context was it found? What surrounds the excerpt being quoted? Is it a plan or a venting of anger that never hardened into action? And in a rush, fragments become confessions. In a careful process, fragments become questions. Now the rifle, a rooftop position, can align with a certain trajectory. But did anyone test competing geometries? In a hall of hard surfaces and moving bodies, echoes fracture into false directions. That's known. But echoes don't explain everything, and they certainly don't timestamp a shot. Which angles were excluded and why? What modeling was done on line of fire with the same stage build, seating map, and mic array? Did investigators reconstruct the scene under comparable lighting and ambient noise, or did consistent with quietly get promoted to proves? If you were in that room, what would you want to know before you accepted the clean version? Would you want the full chain of custody log for the towel, the complete text, context, and provenance of the note? the methods behind any trajectory analysis. The raw timestamps of every 911 call and radio transmission laid beside the first press release. If these records exist, why aren't they public? If they're not complete, why did certainty arrive before the paperwork? None of this says the official account is wrong. It says the official account is fast, and speed has gravity. Once a story hardens, every later detail that doesn't fit is treated like noise instead of signal. Witnesses who heard something from the side. Unreliable. A gap in the minute-by-minute. Clerical. A piece of footage that complicates the arc. Under review. Have we mistaken the comfort of closure for the rigor of truth? Think about the people asked to live inside the version delivered on day one. A widow, children, parents, students who still hear the echo of that night when the hallway goes quiet. If the story shifts later, if a detail once labeled irrelevant becomes essential, they don't just revisit facts, they relive the feeling that certainty was promised too soon. Is it fair to ask them to accept finality when the work that earns finality is still ongoing? There's also a civic cost we rarely name out loud. If the public learns to equate press conference with proof, what happens the next time evidence needs weeks, not hours? What happens to trust when an early narrative must be revised? Do communities grow more careful or more cynical? Do they engage with the process or disengage, convinced they're being managed rather than informed? So let's ask the unglamorous, necessary questions, out loud and now. What does each artifact actually prove? Which parts of the timeline are rock solid and which are still estimates? What contradictions were logged, not waved away? Which uncertainties were acknowledged to the family, to the court, to the public, before the microphones were turned off? If these answers exist, why the hurry? If they don't yet exist, why the confidence? Maybe the official account will stand intact once every test is finished and every file is open. If so, it will be stronger for having been challenged. And if it doesn't, if some piece turns out to be assumption dressed up as conclusion, then the challenge will be what saves us from mistaking neatness for truth. The difference between a story that soothes and a story that stands is not poetry, it's patience. Hold on to that first image, a subtle movement at the back of the hall, a bag, a decision to slip away. Is it a stray detail, a trick of memory, or a thread we're supposed to pull? Who is that? And why does a narrative that arrives so quickly leave room for a shadow like this at all? The official version tells us the shots came from behind, fired from a rooftop overlooking the debate hall. On paper, that sounds simple. But if truth were truly that clean, why do the echoes of that night refuse to fall neatly into one direction? Why do so many who were there, the students pressed against the floor, the professors guiding panicked crowds toward exits, the parents clutching their children, still describe something different? Listen again to the phone footage that spread across social media in the hours after the shooting. Chaos, yes. Screams, yes. But also something else. Sound that doesn't fully obey the official story. Some describe it as sharp cracks splitting from behind the stage. Others insist the noise ricocheted from the side walls, as though it came from within the auditorium itself. A handful swear they heard two distinct bursts, close enough together to suggest not echoes, but separate shots. Are they all mistaken? Or are these fragments pointing to a story investigators have not reconciled? Sound is deceptive in enclosed spaces, that much is true. Hard surfaces scatter and multiply the noise, creating illusions of direction. But echoes do not invent entirely new sources. Echoes cannot fully explain why people on opposite ends of the hall insist the shots came from different places, or why several survivors describe the rhythm of the gunfire as uneven, as though coming from more than one weapon. Could fear have distorted memory? Certainly, but can fear alone account for so many consistent contradictions? Think about the geometry of that hall. A stage at the front, long rows of seats fanning out toward the back, doors along the sides, a high ceiling where sound has room to bounce. Security staff placed at exits. Lighting that leaves corners in half shadow. In such a space, every angle matters. Every line of sight, every direction of sound becomes part of the truth. And yet, were these contradictions ever mapped carefully, tested rigorously, or explained transparently? If so, why are those diagrams not public? And if not, why the rush to declare certainty before the soundscape itself was fully understood? Eyewitnesses add to the unease. A student in the front rows said she was sure the shots erupted from inside the hall. A faculty member on the opposite side described the noise as coming from above, but not directly behind, more angled, more diffuse. Parents seated near the rear reported 2 separate bursts, one after the other. None of them claim perfect clarity. They admit the panic, the shock, the confusion. But taken together, their fragments begin to form a pattern. If so many saw and heard inconsistencies, is it really enough to dismiss them all as unreliable? History offers caution here. Forensic psychology teaches us that in moments of terror, memory bends, compresses, fractures. But it also teaches us that when multiple independent witnesses describe similar anomalies, those anomalies deserve closer scrutiny. They are not proof in themselves, but they are signals. And ignoring signals in favor of a tidy narrative has cost justice before. How many cases have faltered when juries later learned that inconvenient testimony was minimized, that sound analysis was never completed, that contradictions were quietly filed away? Technology exists that could resolve these questions. Acoustic reconstruction can map how shots would have traveled in that hall. Computer modeling can simulate trajectory from multiple positions. Sound forensics can isolate spikes on waveforms, determining whether 2 bursts were echoes or distinct discharges. Were these tools fully used? If so, where are the results? If not, why not? Shouldn't a case of this magnitude demand every scientific safeguard available? Because here's the risk. Once a story hardens, every contradiction becomes an inconvenience instead of a clue. Witnesses who remember differently are written off as confused. Recordings that suggest an alternate angle are left under review. Questions about timing are brushed aside as clerical. But if the echoes and the testimonies point to even the possibility of a second source, then the story of a lone rooftop shooter may not be the whole picture. And isn't the whole picture what justice is supposed to be built on? Imagine being in that room, huddled beneath a row of seats, hearing shots ring out, not once, but twice, and later being told there was only one rifle, one direction, one narrative. Would you accept that? Or would you wonder if your memory, however shaken, still carried a piece of the truth others would rather forget? How many people in that room are living with that very unease tonight? These contradictions are not background noise. They are the living reminders that what was declared clean and final may in fact be incomplete. And if the narrative is incomplete, then the way investigators treated the physical evidence, the rifle, the DNA, the note, deserves to be examined under an even harsher light. Because it is one thing for sound to mislead frightened witnesses, it is another for evidence itself to leave more questions than answers. If sound and sight left contradictions that linger, then surely the physical evidence should cut through the noise, clear, solid, indisputable. That is the promise of forensics. Where memory fails, matter speaks. But what happens when the very artifacts we're told prove guilt begin to raise their own questions? What if the objects meant to seal certainty only open new doubts? Start with the towel. Prosecutors say it was wrapped around the rifle and carried Robinson's DNA. At first glance, that feels damning. DNA, after all, is the gold standard of modern investigation. It doesn't lie. It doesn't forget. It is the signature of presence. But presence is not the same as action. Touch is not the same as trigger. How long had that towel been at the scene? Who handled it before investigators logged it into evidence? Was it stored properly, or could secondary transfer have left traces not tied to the act itself? Did forensic tests distinguish between high-quality, direct contact samples and trace smears that might have come from a casual brush? And how many other profiles were present? Was Robinson's the only DNA, or was the sample mixed? If mixed, how was it passed? These questions may sound technical, but in a courtroom, technical is everything. Without them, DNA on the towel becomes less a conclusion and more a suggestion, heavy with implication but light on certainty. Then there is the rifle, recovered near the scene, positioned in line with the rooftop theory. Ballistics, we're told, match the fatal round. But again, what does match mean here? Was a full ballistic fingerprint established, comparing striations under a microscope? Were test firings conducted in controlled conditions? If so, were they peer-reviewed, cross-checked, verified? Or was consistent with quietly translated into proofs? And more unsettling still, was the chain of custody for the rifle airtight from the moment it was found? Or are there gaps, unspoken but real, that could cast shadows over its journey from rooftop to evidence locker? Consider the note, described as evidence of intent, a half-destroyed document, its surviving words framed as a confession. But intent is not ink alone. Context matters. Who wrote it? How do we know? If Robinson authored it, when and why? Was it dated? Was it finished? What sentences stood before and after the incriminating phrases? Could it have been anger scrawled in private, never meant as action? Could fragments be misread, even misused? History is filled with cases where stray writings, diary entries, text messages, half-thought scribbles were treated as ironclad proof of purpose, only to crumble under scrutiny. Are we watching that pattern repeat? Each artifact tells a story, yes, but stories can be shaped, trimmed, arranged. Taken together, prosecutors argue these objects form a clean arc. Robinson planned, positioned, and pulled the trigger. Yet the closer we look, the more that arc depends on assumption. DNA assumes contact means guilt. A rifle assumes recovery equals exclusive use. A note assumes frustration equals intent. Stack assumptions, and you can build a tower that looks like certainty. But towers built on assumptions don't always stand. The defense has seized on this fragility. They remind us that DNA proves touch, not timing. They argue that possession is not the same as action. They point out that fragments of thought do not equal confession. And whether you agree with their narrative or not, the point lingers. Doubt has a place here, not as speculation, but as a legal principle. Reasonable doubt is not decoration. It is the guardrail that keeps justice from collapsing under its own weight. So we must ask, why were these questions not front and center when the evidence was announced? Why were the towel, the rifle, the note presented as if their meanings were fixed, when in truth, each carried room for interpretation? Was it haste? Was it convenience? Or was it the same need for closure that sped the official story into the headlines before the community could even grieve? If you were sitting on a jury, would DNA on a towel be enough to erase every other doubt? Would a broken note, stripped of context, feel like the voice of intent, or could it just as easily be the sigh of despair? Would a rifle found in proximity to the crime scene close the case for you, or would you want to know exactly how every bullet, every scratch, every fingerprint tied it to that rooftop? Evidence is supposed to silence speculation, but here it seems to echo it. Instead of ending questions, it multiplies them. Instead of cutting through contradictions, it bends back toward them. And when evidence itself bends, the responsibility to scrutinize shifts from optional to essential. Because if the towel only proves contact, if the rifle only proves possibility, if the note only proves emotion, then what do they prove together? Certainty, or simply a narrative arranged to look like certainty? And that is where the weight of silence begins to matter most. Because how investigators handle fragile evidence, whether they test every angle, disclose every weakness, admit every uncertainty, becomes as important as the evidence itself. And in this case, silence has already left its mark. Which brings us to the next layer of doubt. If the evidence was fragile, Why were the delays in disclosure so long? Why were some details revealed immediately, while others were left to trickle out days later? Was it routine procedure, or a deliberate choice to shape what the public believed before the full picture was even available? If the evidence itself raises as many questions as it answers, then the way that evidence was handled, the speed, the silence, the sequence of disclosure, becomes just as important as the artifacts in the evidence locker, because silence is never neutral. Silence is a choice. And in this case, silence may have shaped the story as much as any rifle, towel, or note. Think back to the night of September 10th. The shooting shatters the auditorium. Students are running, faculty members are shouting, emergency services flood in. In those first chaotic hours, communication is messy by nature. No one expects perfect clarity in the middle of panic. But what about the days that followed? That's where procedure should turn chaos into order. Instead, order came too quickly, and the gaps it left behind felt too wide to ignore. Why were certain details released within hours, while others trickled out days later? Robinson's name and the lone rooftop theory hit headlines almost immediately. His photo was everywhere by morning. But the recovered rifle, the half-destroyed note, the timeline of when investigators first reviewed campus security footage, those details arrived slower, sometimes in fragments, sometimes framed in vague language like, "under review." Why the uneven pace? Was it because the evidence itself was fragile, or because the narrative needed time to be arranged? Silence, especially in high-profile cases, often comes disguised as caution. Officials say, "We can't speculate. We must protect the integrity of the investigation." And sometimes that's true. But when caution only applies to inconvenient details, while convenient ones are broadcast instantly, the line between caution and control begins to blur. Consider the witnesses. Students who swore the shots sounded like they came from more than one direction. Some were interviewed early, others later, their accounts filtered, sometimes dismissed as unreliable. But who decides when an eyewitness is confused versus when they're essential? Is it about accuracy or about alignment with the narrative already in motion? Consider the footage, a campus with cameras, phones recording in every corner. We know images of panic spread online within hours. Yet the most crucial frames, the ones that might show the angle of fire, the path of the gunman, even the mysterious figure some describe moving at the back, took days before being acknowledged. And even then, acknowledgement came carefully, often as contextual review or pending verification. Why? Was the footage really so inconclusive? Or was it too disruptive to the story that had already been declared? And consider the institution itself, Utah Valley University, a campus responsible for securing an event featuring a nationally known political figure. Why were rooftops not cleared beforehand? Why was a vantage point behind the hall accessible at all during the debate? In a country where security planning is routine for public speakers, how did those gaps exist? Were they oversights, or were they overlooked because addressing them publicly would cast the institution in a light it could not afford? Delays are not just bureaucratic inconveniences. They reshape perception. Every hour between an event and its disclosure is an hour where the narrative hardens in the public's mind. Once people believe a story, especially one delivered with confidence at a press conference, later corrections sound like excuses, not truths. Silence, in this sense, doesn't just protect the investigation. It protects the first version of the story, even if that version turns out to be incomplete. Ask yourself, when you first heard about this case, did you imagine a single shooter, a rooftop, a rifle, and a note? Was that image clear because it was proven, or because it was delivered early, wrapped in authority, and repeated until it felt like fact? If another shooter existed, if another angle mattered, if a shadow slipped away in that footage, how much harder is it to accept once you've already been taught the one rooftop version? This is the danger of delay. Silence doesn't erase evidence. It buries it beneath layers of assumption. By the time the buried evidence surfaces, The audience has already been trained to dismiss it as noise. Witnesses who contradict the official version are unreliable. Footage that complicates the timeline is inconclusive. Questions about security are ongoing matters. And every step of the way, the silence speaks louder than the facts. And what about the family? Every day of delay isn't abstract to them. It's another day of living inside a version of events that may not be whole. Imagine being Charlie Kirk's widow, his children, his parents. They're asked to grieve under the weight of a narrative that might shift tomorrow. They're told to find closure in a version of truth that may not be complete. How fair is that? How do you ask people to heal when the story itself is still under construction? Here's the uncomfortable question. Are delays the result of careful caution or calculated control? Was silence a method of protecting the case, or was it a method of protecting the institutions involved? The difference matters. One preserves justice, the other preserves reputation. And this is why silence cannot be brushed off as just part of the process. Silence is not harmless. It protects someone. It benefits someone. It always has a direction. In this case, who gained from the pauses? Who was shielded by the delays? Who stayed comfortable while the family carried unanswered questions? We are left with an unsettling possibility that silence didn't just happen, it was chosen. And when silence is chosen, it has weight. It doesn't vanish. It lingers. And that weight leads us toward the next question. How did the public carry it? Because beyond institutions and investigators, this case spilled into living rooms, classrooms, and stadiums. It wasn't just about evidence. It became about perception, division, and forgiveness. And in the days that followed, it wasn't only officials who shaped the story. It was the people. When silence lingers too long, it doesn't just weigh on institutions. It spills into the public square. And that is exactly what happened after the shooting at Utah Valley University. The official story was delivered with speed. The delays in disclosure raised questions, and soon the case stopped being only about evidence. It became about how a divided nation chose to see the same tragedy through very different lenses. For some, the narrative was clean and final. Tyler James Robinson was guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. DNA on the towel, a rifle recovered, a note describing intent. They saw no need for hesitation. To them, demanding more proof felt like an insult to the victim's memory. Justice meant swift conviction, and even the death penalty felt like the natural course of consequence. In their eyes, prolonging the case was prolonging pain, but others looked at the same story and saw gaps too large to ignore. They remembered the echoes that didn't line up, the witnesses who swore the shots came from more than one direction, the footage that hinted at a shadow slipping away. They asked, if this case is truly airtight, why does it need silence to support it? Why do details arrive in fragments instead of all at once? Why is every contradiction brushed aside instead of addressed? For them, rushing to judgment wasn't justice, it was convenience. And in the middle of these polarized voices stood Erika Kirk, the widow. Her response cut through the noise not with anger, but with something harder: forgiveness. At her husband's memorial, inside a stadium filled with tens of thousands, she declared that she would not seek Robinson's death in return for Charlie's. She said she would not have his blood on her ledger. Her words were raw, startling, and for many, disarming. But forgiveness is never simple. Some called it an extraordinary act of strength, an echo of grace in the midst of violence. Others worried it blurred the pursuit of accountability, that mercy without clarity could weaken the demand for truth. Still others saw it as a mirror, forcing the public to ask whether punishment alone ever heals the wound left by violence. This division was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about what justice itself should look like. Is justice a conviction, no matter how fast it comes? Or is it a process, patient and uncomfortable, that demands every stone be overturned, even if that means living longer with doubt? Is justice punishment, or is it truth? And hovering over all of it was the question of security. Why were rooftops left unguarded at an event of this scale? Why were students and families placed in a position where tragedy was even possible? These questions, left unanswered, deepened the sense that institutions failed, not only in the investigation afterward, but in their duty to prevent the crisis in the first place. How do you trust a system that promises protection but leaves holes wide enough for a rifle to fit through? Public discourse became its own courtroom. In living rooms, online forums, and crowded auditoriums, the case was retried daily. Evidence was dissected, witness accounts debated, timelines reconstructed. For every voice calling Robinson guilty beyond doubt, another warned that the case was incomplete. For every demand for punishment, another plea rose for patience. And yet, beneath all the noise, a single truth remained constant. Charlie Kirk was gone. A husband, a father, a public figure, silenced by gunfire on a night meant for debate. Families do not heal through press conferences. Children do not find closure in headlines. Whether the story proves simple or complex, the cost of silence, haste, or error falls on those left behind. So we must ask, what do we do when official answers don't feel sufficient? Do we accept them for the comfort they offer, even if cracks remain? Or do we insist on digging deeper, even if that means reopening wounds? Do we measure justice by speed or by thoroughness? Perhaps the hardest truth is this: closure may never come neatly. If Robinson acted alone, then every unanswered question still matters, because unanswered questions breed doubt. If there was more than one hand in the shadows, then justice delayed has already become justice denied. And if the silence we've witnessed was less about protection and more about convenience, then the system itself stands trial in the court of public trust. The case is not over, not in the courtroom, not in the minds of those who were there, and not in the nation still watching. Every piece of evidence, every delay, every contradiction has left its mark. And now, the responsibility doesn't rest only with investigators or prosecutors. It rests with us, because justice does not move forward on its own. It moves when people ask the questions others avoid. It moves when families refuse to accept half-truths as final. It moves when a public demands clarity instead of convenience. So we return to the haunting question: was Charlie Kirk's death the act of one man on a rooftop, or is there more still hidden in the silence? We don't have the final answer. But perhaps the measure of justice isn't only in whether we solve it. It's in whether we refuse to let silence close it before the truth is ready. And until that truth is unearthed, the story remains unfinished. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.